HTML5 has some amazing client-side form validation capabilities built in, and in this coding video, we shall create a simple form and practice these capabilities in detail. By end of this video, you should be familiar with features like how to apply constraints or input using attributes, invoke built-in HTML5 checks using typed input controls, and how to use the constraint validation API to perform custom validation via JavaScript. You would also see how to provide feedback, suggestions, and tooltips to users instantaneously so he can fix any issues at the spot. Concepts have already been introduced in concept part of this video, so we shall focus on coding in this one. For those who missed it, link is in the description. Best to watch it first, or you can just continue with this one, it's up to you. The coding video will rely on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and I would strongly suggest to follow along. And don't worry if CSS and JavaScript sound scary, as I shall explain each and everything. I'm Ali from Learn Awesome. Let's get started. I shall start by introducing some CSS concepts that we shall use in this video, and then we shall start with actual coding. So CSS experts can use the chapter navigation on scroll bar to skip this section. I'll discuss the listed concepts only, giving you the concept and examples first, then we shall start writing a form and use them later. The first CSS concept we shall look into is pseudo-classes. We introduced them in concept videos, so won't go over details again, but to recap, these built-in classes allow you to style certain states of HTML element. Though not specific to validation, form validation heavily relies on these to create a great user interface and experience. The way to style these elements is to select the target element normally in CSS and then append the pseudo-class separated by a colon sign. Required, in, out of range, and valid, invalid pseudo-classes help you give a unique style to input elements that represent the current state to user. Right, let's switch to Visual Studio Code and see all of this in action. Right, let me create a file first. And in the same breath, add a CSS file. In the HTML file, let me start typing HTML, and Visual Studio Code would create a boilerplate for me. And in here, I'm going to add a link to my style sheet. So for pseudo classes, let's take an example which is not relevant to forms, but we'll have plenty of practice with forms going forward. So for that, I'm going to create an anchor element or hyperlink element, which is a dummy one, so just links to itself, which is not important. And so we just need to focus on its styling. So to do that, let's go to prereq.css and type A to select the hyperlink, since it's the only hyperlink in the document, doesn't matter. And now I'm going to do colon and select hover from the list. And what it's going to do is it's going to apply the style on anchor elements when they are in hover state, like a mouse is hovering over these elements. And the style I'm going to apply is going to be color red. And we have Visual Studio Live Preview extension from Microsoft installed in Visual Studio Code. So let's see the result in the preview. So if I hover, see the style is being applied on the hyperlink element. That is how you use the pseudo classes. At this stage, you just need to know that you can apply these built-in classes after the selector using a colon sign and style them. And the style would only apply when the element is in the particular state that you have styled it for and represented by the pseudo class. So next CSS concept to discuss is pseudo elements, and the formal definition is they allow you to style parts of an HTML element. So taking example of a paragraph element, you can style first line, first letter, or selected text in a paragraph element. So I have provided this example here where using p colon colon first line, we can style the first line of paragraph element only with the color orange, and the rest would be styled normally. Styling of pseudo elements is a bit different from pseudo classes, where we use a double colon sign instead of a single colon sign after the selector to specify which aspect of the element you want to style, like the first line here. and then you apply the style normally. The aspect of pseudo elements that we are most interested in for this video is that on a container element like span or paragraph, you can add a pseudo text before or after the actual element. So what does this mean? It means that if you have any span or paragraph element in your HTML document, and let's say we want another text to appear before or after that, we can use pseudo elements to do so. That part of text would not become part of HTML or DOM and would only exist as a styling artifact. So what does this all mean? Let's switch to Visual Studio Code and try it out, and it would make more sense. So to demonstrate that, let's first add a span element. And I say I am span would be the ID for this span element. I'm going to copy that. Let's head back to CSS. And I again use the hash selector since we are using the ID to select the element. And now I'm going to use the after pseudo element to style it. And now we need to define the content of the text that would appear after the span element. So I say content and say span is awesome. And I should have span. All right. So as you can see, the I am span is the actual text for the span element, and then this is the pseudo element text content that is appearing after the span element text itself. We can add more styling like color red here, and this makes sense. And let me demonstrate another cool feature here. So if let's say I use backslash 2714 as the character, it's going to show a tick mark. Yeah, well, tick mark should appear with green, so it's going to appear as a green tick mark. And what is this 2714? It is a Unicode character that you can use in a text alongside other element, and you are intelligent enough to know where we are going with this. We can use these pseudo elements to give user feedback once the validation is successful or failed. And where do these Unicode characters come from? W3schools.com has a full listing of these Unicode characters as UTF-8 dingbats, and all such codes have been provided. So we are interested in the hexadecimal code. So let's say I want this tick mark uh, with a green background. So I would see 2705 and it would be appear here. And let's say if our validation fails, I'm going to use this cross mark with 274C, and of course that is going to appear in red. And do remember it's a text character, so we can use font size and other font related aspect on this. So to control that, its sizing, it's all in your control. One last thing before we move ahead to our next CSS concept is that we mentioned that pseudo elements can only be applied on container elements like span or paragraph, etc. And by that I mean elements that have an opening tag and a closing tag and child elements in between, since pseudo elements work by manipulating the child elements. So one important thing to remember is that the input element that we would heavily rely on in our HTML forms is not a container element. So pseudo elements cannot be applied on input elements. So how would we do stuff like this then? And that is the topic of our next CSS concept that we need to discuss, which is adjacent sibling selector. So let's go over its formal definition before we go to Visual Studio Code. So the next sibling combinator, adjacent sibling combinator, there are multiple names, means the same thing. It separates two selectors and matches the second element only if it immediately follows the first element and both are children of the same parent element. So basically what we are doing here is that we have two elements and we are saying that in CSS we select the first element and then style the second or target element only if it immediately follows the former or first element. I'm sure it's hard to understand this way, so let's go over to Visual Studio Code and put this in action. Right, to demonstrate that, let's reuse some of the stuff. So I'm going to introduce another span here after the anchor element, and which is invisible since I'm not providing any text in here. And now I go here and I say a plus span, and now I say color is shaded blue. Now nothing is happening because there's no text in here, but here's the cool part where we can use the after pseudo element to demonstrate that we can add some content here. So as you can see, we just use span without using any ID or other selectors, and there are other spans in our example which were not affected by this styling. It only affected the span that immediately appeared after the anchor element, right? To add some more fun to it, let's use it with a pseudo class. So if let's say I say in my former selector, I say a colon hover, see, and change it to hovering. Let's see what happens now. So it is only going to apply this styling on span element if former anchor element is in the hover state. So if I hover over this now, see, the text not only appears but is also appearing with the style that we have specified. Okay, our last CSS prerequisite concept is FlexFlow, which is a CSS property, and it controls direction as well as wrapping behavior of a flex container. Right, and what is a flex container? Flex container is a concept of a Flexbox layout module, which is another layout module just like block or inline in CSS. So the formal definition being the flexible box layout module makes it easier to design flexible responsive layout structure without using float or positioning CSS concepts. Right, it would all make sense once we go to the examples. So let's quickly do that. And since we have taken too much time, I'm going to fast forward the coding part. You can pause and type if you like, but it probably isn't necessary. So here goes. Right, we are done. So as you can see, I created a div, parent div, which is called Papa div. And inside that, I created a set of 5 20 by 20 blocks in different colors. So we'll see how the flex layout affects their layout. So since we are interested in this flex flow property, which is not going to work unless you have display flex specified. So I have multiple ways of arranging these blocks in the flex container, right? And this is the flex container that we are styling. So if I say column, see, all of these blocks are now arranged in a column format. And if I say row, they are being arranged in row. And if I remove this row part, they are gonna just span a row. But if I also specify wrap, then as you can see, they are 20 pixel wide and the total width of the container is 60 pixels. So as soon as they reach the end of the width of the container, they're going to wrap around and start creating another row. So this is an important property that we would be using going forward, you will see. So just knowing this concept is enough for now. So we are finally done with our CSS prerequisites. Took a bit of time, but finally we are done. We can now start with our actual form creation. Okay, I'll start by adding an HTML file and then we'll start to fill it in. Let's add a CSS as well. Okay, now I'll add a very basic form with 3 or 4 fields, and I'm going to fast forward from now. And you can pause the video at the end and copy the code if you're following along. This form will be without validation, so once it's created, we'll start adding validation code. So it's just a basic template form that I'm going to create. All right, I'm done. If you want to pause and look at and copy the code, here it is. So let's preview how it looks like, and looks pretty ugly, right? So let's add some styling to it. So I'm going to head to the CSS file and do some basic styling. All right, forms can be styled in a number of ways, but since our intent is to add validation to the form, what we want is some vertical spacing between these input elements so that we can add our validation tooltips and suggestions there. So what we are going to do is to keep the symmetry, we are going to center the form horizontally and provide some vertical gaps between the elements. So let's begin the styling. So I'm going to keep the width of the form restricted to 500 pixel. So it's going to remain in the center. And I'm going to use the margin property to center the form using margin property 20 pixel auto. So this is going to create a 20 pixel gap between the body and its surroundings, and auto is going to horizontally center the body. So if it's not visible here, but if I bring it up in Chrome, you see 20 pixel margin added from the top. It's only visible at the top, and the form is horizontally centered. Next, what we want to do is we are going to keep the labels and input controls on their own separate lines. So for that, we are going to use label and input and say width 100% and height to be 30 pixels. Right now, they are both in their own respective lines. We can see in the form to validate as well. Good. Input elements are a bit skewed outside because the border is not being taken into account. So we're going to say box sizing border box so that the width calculation takes into account the borders and padding into account, and it's going to properly adjust the input element within its container width. So here we go. It's proper now. Still no vertical gap, so we need to introduce that. Okay, it looks much better now, right? With gaps between them. But it looks pretty bland, so let's do another effect. So let's add a box shadow, which is going to add an inner shadow. I'm not going to go in details of this one. Okay, this looks good. And we can also do a border radius 5 pixels to give it a nice. All right, beautification is done. Let's focus on validation now. So if we go to our HTML file, we can see that our form is pretty much without any kind of validation at this stage. Or is it? Not exactly true. So let me show you. Uh, so let's say I introduce an input of type submit and click it. It's going to submit the form, no error being thrown at this stage. But let's say I type EEEE in my email and press submit. Now it's not going to let me submit. It is giving me an error. Please include an @ of in the email address. So even without doing anything, just using the type attribute properly, you have invoked built-in type validation in HTML5. And it's not restricted to email. We also have file controls, numeric controls, etc. So let's quickly add those. So I say profile pic, and ask the user for, and we say accept equal to image slash static. Now if we go and select this choose file, you will notice it is only restricting it to image files. It won't let us select anything else. So there's also this kind of validation. Similarly, we can have another control. Let me just copy paste and user age. All right, and I'm gonna say type equal to number, and use this here. So if we go here and try to type in, let's say, all right, you can see me now, but I'm trying to type in a word here and it's not letting me. It's only letting me type a number. Yeah, I cannot even type another character in here. So there's also this built-in validation, or rather a restriction that the user is unable to type anything but a number in here. Quite a bit of validations already taken care of at this stage using the type attribute. Then there are input constraints that we talked about in our concepts video. So let's put them to the test. So for example, let's focus on this pet name where we can impose a restriction on length of the pet name using let's say min length attribute. Let's say the name cannot be less than 5 characters, and also max length, the name cannot be more than 20 characters. All right, so let's put this to the test. So if I try DDD, please lengthen this text to 5 characters, currently using only 3 characters. So we can adjust that. I'm just giving an example. We are just demonstrating the feature here. Similarly, it won't let us type a very, very long, you know, so since we capped our max length to 20, it's not even letting me type anything more than 20. So it stops me right there in the tracks. Similarly, for the numeric field, we have similar constraint attributes, so which are going to be min and max. So min is going to be let's say 18, and max is going to be 120. We are not expecting any visitors which are more than 120 years old on our website. So now let me try to enter 5 and submit, and we straight away get an error. Value must be greater than or equal to 18. It won't let us submit the form or let the user sign in if he's entering an age that is below our threshold. Similarly, if a user tries to sign up with his age being 500 years, not gonna work. The form is not gonna allow him. Right. We also had this patron attribute, if you recall from our concepts video, which imposed restriction on what kind of input the user can type in a text field. So to put that to the test, since type equal to email had built-in type validation, so let me change that, and let's introduce an alt email, and which is going to be of type text. But here I'm going to introduce the patron. So I'm going to copy and paste the pattern that we had in our concepts video, which we used for email, and let's put that to the test and see if it works and validates email successfully. Again, re-emphasizing it's of type text, so pattern is the only validation check there is. So so if I type again KKK, let's see what happens. Yeah, it's gonna say please match the requested format, not the elaborate kind of error that we had with email, but an error nonetheless. But if I say a at bbb.com, then it
does work. If I press submit, it did work. So patron is a very useful validation constraint that is extremely useful, but you need to be familiar with regular expressions to create those patrons. And I'll surely be posting another video on regular expression shortly, which depending on when you're watching this video might already be there. So do check it out. So lots of built-in validations we have discovered, but there is still a problem that the validations are only kicking in once we type something in the form. Otherwise, when we press submit, it's unrestricted, letting us submit a blank form, which obviously is something that you would ever consider allowing the user to do. So some of the fields that we have in our form must be required. Let's do that. So for that, the HTML5 has graciously provided us with a required attribute on the input control. So let's say we introduce that on our first name and last name. And let's see what happens if we try and submit our form now. So if I press submit, see it scrolled up to the input field that was required and had blank value, and it is giving me an error. Please fill out this field. Another good bit of validation that is kicking in, but here's a problem. Say this only happened once we tried to submit the form. Let's say my pet name was required and I just typed in first name, last name, and email and press submit. How would I know the pet name was required? Or the first name and last name are the required values, right? I might only be trying to sign up giving my email, assuming email is the only required thing. So there must be some visual indicator that which fields are required before the user presses the submit button. That's always a good UX. Having required attribute with these errors also helps, but it's not very useful because again, you see, it's giving me error only on first name while we added the required attributes on two input fields, first name and last name. So user still has no idea that he's missing out on some required fields. So if let's say I type Ali and press submit, now it gives me error on the last name. So I still have no clue which input fields are required. I'm not gonna press submit tens of times to identify all the required fields. So something definitely needs to be done about this. So let's focus on that. So that's the difference between a good UI and bad UI. So let's make it a good UI. Currently it's not. Now we are going to make use of the CSS concept that we saw in the beginning of the video. So let's start. So I'm going to introduce two blank spans for both the required fields. Okay, and now I head back to my CSS file and I am going to make use of this. So this is how it's going to play out. So we only want to show this. So we are going to visually show an indicator on the input fields that are required. The first step in doing so is identifying which fields are required, and that can be done using a pseudo class required, which is present on the input field. So we are going to make use of input required, input colon required, which is only going to select the input elements that have required attribute applied on them. And now we are going to use the adjacent sibling selector or combiner or whatever the name is. There are tens of names for that. And we are going to say span colon colon after, and we are going to say content to be required. Right, 0 points for guessing that something is not right here. That required should not be appearing before last name and email. They are supposed to be appearing. Um, we intend to make them appear somewhere here in smaller font. So that's what we intend to do. And to do that, we need to absolutely position them relative to the span element that they are being applied on as pseudo elements. But the first thing that we need to do is to bring that parent span element next to the input control.
And to do that, we need to enclose all of these label and input control and span in divs in their own respective divs. So let me call it a required div. Okay, and next I'm gonna copy and paste it for the next required div. And yes, okay, still a few more steps to do. So we are gonna apply a position absolute on this one, this pseudo text. Sorry, not absolute on this pseudo text, and that is gonna bring it here. But an absolutely positioned element needs to move around based on its relative parent, a first positioned parent. And this one does not have a position parent. So let's say if I say uh, um, left colon 10 pixels, it's gonna position itself relative to the body element because body is the first position element here. So if I can show you, it's being positioned next relative to the body element, not span element as we discussed. So let's fix that. So to do that, we go input colon required and plus and then the span element. Notice I'm not styling the pseudo element here. I am styling the span element itself, and I'm gonna say position and relative here. Okay, and this time this left 10 pixel, if we go back to Chrome and see, it is now our span element being zero sized is appearing here. It's not wrapping around, and the 10 pixel for the left property got applied on the pseudo element relative to the span element. So now let's make some changes and make it minus 10 pixels, and I think minus 50 or minus 80. Yeah, minus 70 pixels seems to be good. And we can similarly do a top and give it a value of minus 30 pixels, 20 pixels, 25 pixels seems good. Uh, yeah, this seems good. All right. We can also apply some further changes like reduce its font size. So we can say it is extra small. Okay, and we can wrap this in a tiny box so it stands out. So background color black and its color is going to be white. We apply padding of 2 pixels. I think 3 pixels would be a good compromise. Yeah, but then we need to give minus 23 pixels, and yes, it looks good. Now I do understand that this is a bit overwhelming way of doing things, and it's not that straightforward either. Like just adding a style, and anytime you add required attribute to some other input field, it's gonna work. It's not. So you still have to. Let's say I want this pet name to be a required input field, and I add the required attribute. So the flag is not gonna come up right away unless you enclose it in a div and add the span attribute afterwards, then it's gonna work automatically. So yes, this is overwhelming, but let me tell you another way of styling required elements and show you the problem with that. So here we are flagging the required attributes on the UI, but if let's say you go input colon required and just style them right away. For example, I can say border color for required element should be red, right? Now, do you see the issue? The border color for these two required elements is already red, even though if I add required to this pet, this also becomes red straight away. So user has a visual indication and in an easy way, a visual indication that these are required fields. But the problem with required attribute is that a required input field, which does not have a value, is already taking on this style. And this does not get fixed with another pseudo class, which is available on um, uh, the input element, which is the invalid. That is the pseudo class that is applied when validation fails on an input element. So if let's say I add border style dashed on this, right, and you can straight away see the required and invalid are both being applied even when we have just loaded the form. We haven't even started filling in any values. And the reason is that a required input field with no value is invalid to begin with. And that is an issue. Sometimes you don't want that to happen. Sometimes you want them highlighted in red only after you have submitted the form, right? So you have all the options available with you if you want to do it. There are ways with JavaScript, which we are going to see at end of this video to mitigate such issues, but just trying to control the form with styling, this is a problem you have to deal with. I mean, if you're not using JavaScript at all, then these are the problems you have to live with. So in that case, having such tags is a good compromise because they are not bright red, error style prompts telling user something has gone wrong here. They are just visual indicators. And also it's using the best practice because the required attribute is both textual and color-based information. So it's gonna work for colorblind people as well. Okay, one more thing that I would like to show you that we can also have this flag as well as success and failure for valid and invalid options available on the fields. So to do that, we can make use of those Unicode characters that we talked about. So let's say if I say I want any invalid input field to be marked with cross mark. So to do that, I'm going to introduce another span, and this time I'm going to use the before span. So remember, we can add pseudo text both before and after our regular span element. So we have already utilized the after one, and now we can utilize the before one. So to do that, I can make use of content colon and let me see, it was 274C, 274C. Yeah, and its color is already red, so we don't need to worry about that. Its position needs to be adjusted though, so we have already done half of the part here by marking the span's position to relative. So all we need to do is introduce the position absolute here, and yeah, it's now at the right location. We need to reduce the font size though, so small, right, and top needs to be adjusted. Yeah, looks good. Okay, and for valid, we are gonna do the exact same thing, just with a different code. So I'm going to use 2714 and make the color green. Okay, we can introduce a padding left of X, make it a little bit away from the input field, right? Looks good. Okay, that's how we can add
these, but remember there's a problem with this, that it would only work, these icons are only gonna appear alongside elements which have this span element added after their input field. So probably you would have to do it for all the label input sets that exist to make that happen all across the form. I'm not gonna do it right now for all, but you get the idea on how to do this, right? One thing I can do, however, is if something is invalid, I'm gonna say border style dashed and border color to be red to indicate a failure. So if, let's say, I now give DDD an email, which is not a required field, then it's gonna fail. Similarly, alternate email is also going to fail. The pattern check, it's also going to turn red. So the user is visually going to get an indication straight away that something has gone wrong. Ideally, you should have a consistent look and feel for required and invalid. So you are better off replicating this div and span all around to make a consistent field. So I can demonstrate for one. So let's say for this alternate email, I enclose it in div, and now if I give a wrong value here, why is the icon not appearing alongside? It went all the way up here. Why? Okay, here was the problem. We had only applied position relative on input required, so we also need to do it on input invalid plus span and input valid plus span. So now it's gonna work. Here we go. See what I mean when I say forms make you go crazy? Well, maybe they are not the reason or the cause, but I'm gonna blame them anyway. So, all right, one more thing that I want to bring up is that we have so far styled all the input elements generically, right? Like input colon valid, input current invalid, and now you have the tools in your toolbox to style or customize the behavior of the before and after pseudo elements to give user indications of whether something was successful or not. But they can also be creatively used to give additional information to user. So I'll just demonstrate one issue. Let's say I want to customize the message the user receives if user age entered is invalid, right? So for that, let me go here and the styling is totally messed up. We'll need to fix that. Okay. All right, so now if I go here and type something invalid, currently the previous input style is being applied, but let's change that. So if I come here and I select the ID age here and colon invalid plus span colon after, and now let's say I say the content is please enter age between 18 and 120. Okay, what would happen if I give 3 now? All right, everything is messed up. Here's because we have all these styles applied above. So to fix that, we would need to position it absolutely so that it does not conflict with the other ones. So let's apply position absolute here and make the font size smaller. And now let's see what happens. Yeah, it's appearing here. We also need color red to indicate that's an error situation. Okay, now we need to style it. So let's pick the old span after values and see what happens. Yeah, it's not working out, so we probably need some more juice here. Too much. Maybe we can show it under where there's more space. Yeah, works. Or if we can give it 150, then it's probably gonna appear in the right location. Right. So if we give the correct age, let's say 44, then the error disappears and the tick mark is appearing in its place. Okay, but do you see a problem with this way of doing things? The issue is that it's totally inconsistent with the other error notifications. So like, for example, if we give this email and submit, this is the HTML5 way of prompting you with the error message. And our way is totally different. So apparently is not an issue. We are giving a more customized message to the user, but it is an issue. So the ideal way is that we are able to maintain consistency across different messages, but that requires the use of JavaScript, where the constraint validation API of HTML5 provides us a way to validate the input controls and provide our own error messages. But on a case by case basis. But if you are not going that way, then these are some of the styling considerations that you can apply. And one final word on this user age thing, which was a numeric control, was that you can also use specific pseudo classes like out of range and in range, which are counterparts of invalid and valid, to customize your error. So right now we used invalid, but you can always use or override it with out of range, which is a specialized version of invalid that the number user entered is specifically not within given min and max range. For all other errors, the invalid error would apply.
So if you just want to stick with HTML and CSS, then this is the limits and constraints that we have to live with. And to go beyond that and take full control of the UI reporting and validation, you need to venture into JavaScript, which lets you not only do custom validation via code, but also take a more fine-grained control over how you report errors and rather get around many of the limiting factors that we have just discussed. So I was supposed to introduce JavaScript at this stage, but this video has gone way too long and I don't want to rush you through JavaScript since it would be new for many of you folks, and I would like to explain the things as I go through that coding part. So I would rather defer it to its own separate video than making it part of this one. This is already way too long, I guess. So please do check that part out. I would be posting it shortly, and it should be there by the time you're watching it. If not, you can always consider to subscribe to the channel and be notified when it is uploaded. And if you liked this video, I would appreciate if you give a thumbs up. And do check out the JavaScript video as it would definitely take you to the next level. So thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Goodbye.